Resident Evil 4 is one of the most pivotal releases in gaming history, grandfathering some of modern gaming's most iconic releases and setting a standard that continues to influence the medium today. While the game is often regarded as one of the greatest ever made, what many may not know is that during its development, the title went through several versions, some ideas reworked, others repurposed, and many scrapped entirely. What's more, had history played out even slightly differently, if the GameCube had been a bit more powerful, or if series creator Shinji Mikami had succumbed to the immense pressure he faced, the Resident Evil 4 we know today might have looked entirely different, if it would have existed at all. But beyond the chaos of its development, a bigger question remains. Has Resident Evil 4's legacy survived? 2 decades later, is the original still the best way to play it, or has the greatest game ever made become a relic of the past? Welcome to Under the Spotlight. In 1998, Sony Computer Entertainment was at the top of its game. The PlayStation was absolutely dominating the market and, despite its age, continued to outsell its rivals with more than double the combined sales of the Nintendo 64 and Sega Dreamcast worldwide. But by this point, the PlayStation was 4 years old, and fans were growing restless for something new, especially as rumors began to flood every gaming mag's front page that something groundbreaking was underway at Nintendo. The company was reportedly developing a revolutionary new system that would make the Nintendo 64 look primitive by comparison. In the wake of the hoopla surrounding their competitor's product, Sony knew that they needed to answer, and answer fast. And they did, by saying absolutely nothing at all. The PlayStation had been built with longevity in mind, but the N64 and even the Dreamcast delivered Sony a rude awakening when they hit the market. Competition was gaining on them, and even slowly starting to create a lead of their own. If Sony didn't act soon, they risked losing everything that they had built since the PlayStation's release in 1994. Yet they knew it was a far greater risk to speak too soon and promise something that they couldn't realistically deliver. So instead, they agreed to keep their internal plans close, sworn to absolute secrecy, and quietly got to work. The PlayStation's longevity gave Sony a major advantage. They could compete with Sega and Nintendo's software libraries without rushing new hardware to the market. This bought them crucial time to get their ducks in a row and map out a strategy for entering gaming's 5th generation. Unlike the Super Nintendo or the Genesis, the PlayStation was capable of hosting both 16-bit and fully 3D 32-bit experiences, something fans of competing consoles often needed separate hardware to enjoy. And while it didn't boast a 64-bit processor like the N64 or the heavily marketed 128-bit power of the Dreamcast, it still delivered games that matched and often exceeded the quality of its rivals' releases, with titles like Tomb Raider, Final Fantasy VII, and Crash Bandicoot leading the charge. And while at face value, it appeared as though Sony was hesitating in the face of progress, what people didn't realize was that Sony wasn't nearly as late to the next generation as they seemed. In fact, they were 2 steps ahead the entire time. For the past 5 years, the father of PlayStation, Ken Kutaragi, had been secretly laying the groundwork for a new golden age, an age called PlayStation 2. Development for the PlayStation 2 was in full swing, and by late 1999, several of Sony's partner studios were nearing completion on titles that were set to launch alongside the highly anticipated system, such as EA's SSX and the sequel to From Software's title, Armored Core. But while some studios were putting the finishing touches on their projects and planning where they'd spend their well-deserved vacations, others were only just getting started. Resident Evil was one of Sony's powerhouse franchises, yet for all its strengths, there really wasn't much room left for the story to evolve. With fixed camera angles, isolated environments, and repetitive enemies and scenarios, the formula and gameplay had grown stale and worn over the years, to the point where even the series' own creator, Shinji Mikami, began to feel a growing disdain for the franchise. And the recent release of Kichiro Toyama's Silent Hill only emphasized how dated Resident Evil was beginning to feel. Despite being a relatively young franchise, fans were growing tired of the same repackaged experiences. RE was at the risk of fading into the background, and nobody felt this more profoundly than Mikami himself. He knew that if they were going to make another Resident Evil, it wasn't going to be anything like the RE that everybody knew. If the series was going to survive and the game be positively received, they would have to take a massive leap of faith, adapt to the modern gaming experience, and break free of the mold they'd established over the past 3 years. It was an extremely bold gamble, but it was one he knew they had to make. The first person Mikami brought on to the project was none other than his talented colleague and former Resident Evil 2 collaborator, the legendary Hideki Kamiya. Mikami immediately shared his vision for the new Biohazard with him, a game that leaned far more into action than the traditional survival horror formula, and one that abandoned the fixed camera angles of the past in favor of something modern and approachable, a design that could welcome both casual players, longtime fans of the series, and those who had never experienced Resident Evil 1, 2, or 3 in the first place. The tense, dark, edge-of-your-seat survival experience still existed in the previous games and could easily be experienced by playing them. This one was meant to bring a new generation into the fold. Kamiya fell in love with Mikami's vision instantly, but an ambition of this scale demanded a storyteller capable of drafting a scenario that's worthy of such creative aspirations. And without a moment's doubt, he knew exactly who that person had to be. None other than the esteemed television and video game writer Noboru Sugimura. Sugimura presented Mikami and Kamiya with a draft that broke sharply from the established Resident Evil formula, emphasizing the cool and stylized aesthetic that was beginning to dominate late 90s, early 2000s media. The story was set within a massive European castle and centered largely around the mystery of the game's protagonist, Tony, an invincible man gifted with superhuman intellect and the physical powers to match. As players progressed, they would slowly uncover the truth. Tony's powers weren't supernatural, nor were they a gift. Instead, they were man-made, the result of yet another twisted experiment born from Umbrella's biotechnologies. It was exactly the kind of story Kamiya and Mikami believed the next Resident Evil should tell. So with little hesitation, the project was greenlit and Biohazard 4 officially entered development. As development progressed, the game gradually began to find its own identity. Yet as Kamiya's team brought their ideas and concepts to life, it also started to drift away from the feel of a true Resident Evil experience. In previous entries, like RE2 for example, no matter the situation Leon found himself in, he never seemed helpless or panicked. He was calm, composed, and handled each crisis with a sense of resolve that Kamiya could only describe as cool. Yet no matter how hard they tried, the project seemed to lack that stoicism so often attributed to Resident Evil protagonists. If anything, the game was beginning to look laughably cartoonish. The project they envisioned emphasized action and style, the cool factor, and you can't exactly achieve that when the protagonist feels more clown than cool. Kamiya was determined to fix this, and the only solution was to dismantle the very element that had set Resident Evil apart from its competition since the beginning: re-rendered backgrounds. It wasn't that Kamiya had any disdain for them, nor was he intent on dismantling the formula entirely. It's just that each time the team sat down to playtest their work, they found themselves wanting to manipulate the camera in ways that simply weren't possible with the fixed perspective the series was known for. The fixed angles made it easy to coordinate a jump scare or build tension through careful framing, but for all their benefits, they hindered the experience Kamiya and his team were trying to create. So despite the progress they made, Kamiya chose to scrap the build entirely and start over again, crafting a version that was far more dynamic and capable of delivering the experience they envisioned. In order to achieve what they wanted, the environment itself would have to move with the player. On paper, it sounded like a small adjustment, but in practice, it proved far more challenging than Kamiya anticipated. Up to that point, the team have been able to kinda skip a large portion of development by just using Capcom's extensive library of textures and backdrops, the accumulated remnants of 3 years worth of RE projects and concepts. But now, with the plan to build an entirely new engine filled with new models, environments, and textures, the team faced an unpleasant truth. They'd have to build it all from scratch. Not that you'd hear any complaints from them though. The task was monumental, sure, but it came with a rather appealing perk. To capture the realism they wanted, the developers embarked on an 11-day trip across Europe, photographing the textures and architecture they'd need. In short, they got a paid vacation, and it only made the game better. With a new library of assets now at their disposal, development once again started and progressed steadily over the next few months. The build was actually coming together quite nicely, and the team showed no signs of falling behind schedule. Everything was running smoothly until one day, Kamiya reached a bittersweet realization. The game they were building was undeniably good, but it was also undeniably not a Resident Evil game. It delivered on every goal they had set, and the new camera system that they had developed, a tight over-the-shoulder interpretation of third person, completely transformed gameplay, making it far more engaging and fluid than they had ever imagined. But no matter how much evil they crammed in, it simply wasn't the Resident they were looking for. And as much as Mikami hated to acknowledge it, Kamiya was right. If they truly wanted to respect their existing fan base and the legacy of the franchise, this title that they were currently developing should not be released as part of the Resident Evil series. Frustration soon set in among staff, some even reporting feelings of despair. They were excited to be part of something new, especially such an iconic franchise, yet they held too much respect for Resident Evil's legacy to see it undermined by such a radical departure from what had made the series so legendary. Mikami understood and shared their concerns. He wanted nothing more than to honor his creation and deliver the experience fans truly wanted and deserved, even if it meant starting over. Reluctantly, he would ask Kamiya to halt production on the game as a Resident Evil title and continue it under a new name. Kamiya agreed, though it meant him leaving Resident Evil behind. 2 years later, their vision would make its debut as Devil May Cry. By November 2000, DMC was in full development and had been officially revealed to the public by Capcom. Though in the wake of its rising success, the original project it had begun as had nothing to show for itself. It wasn't that faith in the franchise was gone or that Mikami had any intention of abandoning his creation. It was just a bitter truth to accept. What they were building had ironically become too cool, too stylish, and frankly, too fun to function within the confines of Resident Evil. That realization cut deep, but Mikami wasn't the type to retreat in the face of disappointment. With Kamiya's departure, focus on the PlayStation 2 hosting the next Resident Evil had shifted. In a dual effort to further captivate a brand new audience and rebuild bridges between Capcom and Nintendo, the GameCube was chosen as the new host for the project, a decision heavily supported by Mikami. But by the time this decision was made, they had lost more than a year of critical development. So in an effort to salvage what remained, Mikami made a decisive choice. Whatever came next for Resident Evil 4 would build on the setting and scenario that they had originally created, with some adjustments wherever appropriate. During this time, Capcom's development divisions were undergoing significant restructuring. The birth of something new demanded a careful reallocation of resources and staff to ensure all ongoing projects could continue. Some team members followed Kamiya to work on Devil May Cry, while others remained behind. But one reality remained unchanged. Kamiya was gone, and in his absence, the project faced a substantial void. Filling it wasn't gonna be easy, but Mikami had already lost too much time to hesitate. To keep the project alive and assume the role of director, Mikami turned to his trusted colleague he had worked with on Resident Evil 3 tree, Hiroshi Shibata. And although the scenario would remain largely intact, it still required careful revisions and a structural overhaul. So once again, Mikami enlisted the talents of Noboru Sugimura and his team at Flagship, calling on them to craft another scenario capable of carrying Resident Evil 4 down a path with renewed purpose. This time bolstered by the expertise of one of the masterminds behind RE3, Yasuhisa Kawamura. They quickly reshaped the original stylish narrative into something familiar yet distinct, ensuring that it wouldn't overshadow the success Kamiya and his team were enjoying with Devil May Cry. Many of the core elements remained. Leon would infiltrate a European castle, become infected during the mission, and confront a variety of new enemies along the way, this time mostly zombies. But several notable changes were introduced. Instead of the castle belonging solely to Umbrella founder Oswald E. Spencer, as it did in Kamiya's version, this iteration reimagined it as the headquarters of Umbrella's European division. And this time, Leon was no longer investigating the enigmatic founder himself, rather he was deployed as part of the elite anti-Umbrella pursuit and investigation team in a coordinated raid on the facility. Upon breaching the castle grounds, the unit quickly encounters the Black Fog, a bioweapon unleashed by the HCF as part of their own simultaneous assault on the castle. When the mission inevitably goes wrong, Leon would find himself stranded within the fortress, forced to confront a gauntlet of horrors, this time framed within a more traditional Resident Evil structure, complete with fixed camera angles, but with that deliberate push towards heightened kinetic action Mikami had in mind. During development, it was also intended for Leon to eventually acquire special abilities in his left hand, though the exact nature of these powers or how he obtains them was never fully defined. What was documented, however, was the inclusion of several first-person sequences throughout the game, marking a would-have-been first for the series. For a time, everything seemed to be falling into place. Development progressed smoothly, and by November 2002, Gamefront reported that the game was over 40% complete. The next Resident Evil looked promising, and as the development team welcomed the new year in, they were preparing Resident Evil 4 for a holiday 2003 release. But then they hit a problem. The issue that plagued Kamiya's version had been its tone. It didn't feel like Resident Evil. That wasn't the case here. This new castle build struck the perfect balance of classic survival horror and Hollywood-style action. The issue this time was far more fundamental. The GameCube couldn't run the game. What the team had built was visually striking, ambitious, and technically demanding, far more than the hardware was ever designed to handle. And the deeper development progressed, the more strain the GameCube was forced to endure. The breaking point arrived when work began on the Black Fog. The concept was that this entity would stalk Leon throughout the castle, reacting much like Mr. X in Resident Evil 2, but rather than relying on humanoid features, the creature would be composed entirely of black tentacles, each capable of moving, contorting, and attacking independently, and the core of its body would be shrouded with an ominous cloud of darkness, a design choice meant to heighten psychological dread and preserve an air of mystery. It was in many ways the perfect antagonist for the experience they were crafting. Yet as production continued, it became clear that the creature was far more ambitious and far more resource intensive than the hardware could ever realistically support. Even when they stripped away everything else the console needed to load, the GameCube's memory would immediately hit its limit the moment it attempted to render a single room, or even the simplest enemy AI. Worst of all, it couldn't render the Black Fog at all. No matter what optimizations they attempted, the system simply couldn't display the creature with any stability while maintaining the rest of the game's visual fidelity. And every workaround, including drastically simplifying its design, resulted in something that looked embarrassingly cartoonish and wholly unfit for the tone the team was pursuing. Worse yet, the entire entire plot depended on the black fog. From Leon's first steps into the castle all the way to the final reveal of the HCF's involvement, the creature was woven into the story's very foundation. Fixing it wouldn't simply require adjustments, it would mean dismantling the narrative altogether and starting over again from scratch. Had the GameCube been more powerful, or perhaps if the team was willing to scale back their ambition a bit, this version of Resident Evil 4 is the one we would be playing today. But unfortunately, those weren't the cards that the universe dealt, and this ended up not being the case. While the story would live on through Kazuhiro Chia's haunting ground, without Black Fog, the project just wouldn't be the same. So Mikami once again halted development, and just like that, Resident Evil Castle was gone. Resident Evil 4 had been in development for almost 4 years, and Mikami had nothing but failure to show for it. He was growing frustrated at the falsehood of their progress. Silent Hill was gaining a significant audience, and the franchise that had inspired its creation was falling leagues behind, and Mikami knew they couldn't survive much longer in this state. The project needed to restart, but this time there was a silver lining. They didn't need to restructure the studio behind it. So with no loss of momentum, they went right back to the drawing board, grabbed what little scraps they could salvage, and got back to work. Hiroshi was a big fan of the castle setting. He proposed that they try taking a different direction. He suggested that instead of having Leon battle infected enemies, why not have him fight against enemies of his own creation? Why not have him battle hallucinations? The most infamous version of Resident Evil 4 to exist, Biohazard Hallucination, entered development almost immediately after Mikami put a stop to the development of Biohazard Castle. While Hiroshi would remain as the game's director, Noboru unfortunately saw this second failure as a sign that he should amicably part from the project and pursue other ventures. This left the team in need of a new scenario writer, and although Mikami deeply wished Noboru could have stayed, they had no time to waste, so he entrusted Kawamura with the responsibility of succeeding him and filling the massive shoes he left behind. Kawamura was a big fan of horror movies, particularly the 1990 classic Jacob's Ladder. The story of Jacob Singer's trauma-induced hallucinations following a secret military experiment was part of what gave him a passion for horror media, and with the recent release at the time of the now cult classic The Lost Souls, his passion for psychological horror had rapidly risen to the surface. He was especially inspired by a particular scene where Winona Ryder's character Maya hallucinates in a restroom and perceives two versions of the room at the same time. One that exists within a tangible reality and one that exists solely in her mind. He and Noboru had already attempted a scenario far more cookie cutter and in line with a traditional Resident Evil experience. Though he admired the writer for his achievements, Kawamura couldn't help but admit that he felt the original scenario they had crafted was just a bit too logical and predictable for a game that was supposed to reinvent the franchise. This time around, Kawamura wanted to draw from the horrors that had impacted him most, those that couldn't be easily rationalized. For all intents and purposes, viruses are logical, hallucinations are everything but. What you see may or may not be real, and the torment of confronting threats that might not even exist, he believed would terrify players at their core. And while it may not have had a direct influence, Silent Hill had proven just how hungry audiences were for psychological horror. And as the saying goes, if you can't beat them, join them. As Kawamura worked on the story, the development team was eager to get started on their build for this new version of RE4. The game would once again take place in a European castle, and just like in Kamaya's version, the fortress served as Spencer's home, with no intention of it functioning as a headquarters. Leon would now be investigating the Umbrella Corps creator for an undisclosed, likely unwritten reason, and would in the process become infected with the progenitor virus, one of Spencer's own creations. The virus induces hallucinations within its host, hallucinations that would force Leon to struggle with distorted perceptions as he navigates maze-like corridors in a desperate attempt to escape the hell he finds himself himself in. As he runs through the halls, he encounters sinister suits of armor, haunted dolls, and the infamous Hookman. Even though Kawamura sought to stray as far as possible from the traditional virus-based threat, he couldn't deny that its inclusion worked to everyone's advantage. It provided both a familiar anchor for longtime fans, while simultaneously granting him the freedom to break completely from RE's established foundations, an incredibly bold choice that Mikami wholeheartedly supported. As development continued, the project once again looked incredibly promising. The game they were crafting showed every sign of stability, and Kawamura's vision of a hallucinated threat was slowly beginning to take form. Yet, beneath the momentum, familiar cracks were starting to surface. Life is truly nothing more than a bittersweet dark comedy, and there's no greater testament to that than the fate of Resident Evil Hallucination. This was a version that aligned perfectly with Mikami's vision for the future of the franchise, but the team overlooked one critical truth. They were still developing for the GameCube. The experience was coming together exactly as intended, but when it came time to implement the game's defining system, the hallucinated rooms and the creeping fog that signaled their arrival, the hardware once again couldn't keep up. To be fair, it wasn't the same level of critical memory failure that they saw with Biohazard Castle, but it was still severe enough to render the game clunky, fragmented, and ultimately unplayable. To make Leon's hallucinations work, the team needed to load 2 simultaneous versions of every room he entered. It was an ingenious idea, and arguably essential for the mechanic to feel seamless and psychologically gripping, but it demanded far more than the GameCube could ever hope to deliver. While the team could have made compromises to force the game into a playable state, doing so would have sacrificed much of its quality and integrity, and Mikami just refused to let what was meant to be the series' grand reinvention collapse into a technical farce. This was meant to be the experience that reminded the industry why Resident Evil reigned as the definitive survival horror, and that Mikami was the uncontested, undisputed king of horror gaming. By the fall of 2003, Resident Evil 4 should have been in the final stages of production. The development team was poised for a well-earned break, ready to bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. Instead, fate had dealt a cruel hand for the 3rd time. The game was supposed to be finished. Mikami's morning should have started with coffee, a healthy breakfast, and the first reviews of the newly released Resident Evil 4. Instead, he arrived at his office to nothing. A pile of broken mechanics, incomplete systems, and a scenario that had long lost its shape. It was around this time that Shibata would approach Mikami one last time with a concept that was just far too underwhelming to ever earn the green light as an RE experience. The passion was there, but it was evident that repeated false starts had taken a toll on the confidence of Studio 4, and his proposal only reflected that struggle. It aimed to return to Resident Evil's roots, essentially recycling elements from RE 1, 2, and 3, just rearranged in a slightly new way. This version, famously dubbed Biohazard Zombie, would feature unique enemies known as Dobermen, though in practice they behaved almost exactly like zombies. Mikami had to shoot the proposal down, criticizing it for being the very thing he didn't want the game to be. He felt that the standard Resident Evil formula was overplayed, and if he didn't say it enough before, he would make a point to say so now. Resident Evil was washed, and Shibata had lost sight of what he had originally set out to accomplish. And after failure upon failure upon failure, Mikami had seen enough. He decided it was time to take matters into his own hands.
This sucks, man.
Resident Evil 4 teetered on the brink of destruction as series creator Shinji Mikami stepped in to take the helm as director. Shibata had done an incredible job given the circumstances and would remain on the team as a designer, but Mikami knew that they were down to the wire, and the team desperately needed his guidance because this time they couldn't fail. So with everything at stake, Resident Evil 4 would for one last time officially enter development. Having the series creator directly involved began to restore the team's confidence, but the scars of so many failed ideas ran deep. Several staff members voiced serious concerns to Mikami, some even mentioning feelings of depression when he proposed to them that they should still reinvent the series and stray from the path they had long followed. And arguably, they had a point. They had tried 3 times already to reinvent Resident Evil, and what did they have to show for it? A success story that none of them had helped create, and 2 builds of broken, unplayable garbage. Their concern was absolutely justified, and Mikami understood their frustration, but he also knew that the pain they felt now would pale in comparison to the crushing defeat of releasing a game that fell flat and betrayed their ambition. Simply sticking to the formulas that had carried them so far would not deliver the same victory that Kamiya and his team were seeing with Devil May Cry. Maintaining the status quo would only delay the inevitable and steer them towards slow, certain failure. The victory they sought demanded risk, and Mikami was determined to lead them through it. To win them over, he drafted a scenario that satisfied both the team's desire to stay close to the series' roots and his own ambition to push the franchise into newer territory. The scenario was unlike anything before it. Instead of centering around Umbrella Corps, this story focused on a community ensnared by the horrors of a parasite known as Las Plagas. Umbrella remained in the background, giving the scenario a warm sense of familiarity, all while matching that Hollywood-level intensity and action that Mikami wanted. It really was an action-adventure experience that felt fresh, while somehow still honoring its Resident Evil roots. The team was sold. Doubt evaporated almost immediately. With fear and uncertainty gone, development roared to life, giving the project a momentum that would carry it out of development hell and to its place as one of the most influential game releases of all time. For 5 long years, Resident Evil 4 battled through failure, uncertainty, and the creeping threat of cancellation, yet against all odds, it finally released in January 2005. And I'll just say it right now, if you enjoy modern gaming at all, you best thank the good Lord above that this game actually made it to release, because its impact is so enormous, so far-reaching, that nearly every major third-person game carries a piece of its DNA. So much so that without it, the games we enjoy today would be fundamentally different if they would even exist at all. For example, none of these games you see here would exist if it wasn't for Resident Evil 4. And I'm not kidding. The craziest part is that realistically, RE4 shouldn't have released at all. Very few games survive a rewrite, let alone an entire reboot. Especially as a Dead Space fan, I'm incredibly thankful that they went through literal hell to make sure that this game released. Not just because it influenced one of my favorite games of all time, but because it too happens to be one of the best games I've ever played. Now, of course, it has its flaws, awkward dialogue among them.
Hasta luego.
No way, Leon.
Way?
It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps.
But these imperfections, I feel, don't ruin the experience. If anything, they lend the game a personality and charm that belongs solely to it and it alone. Even the things that initially come off as grating or annoying eventually become an odd comfort, knowing that every time you hear that dumb-ass voice, you've hit a checkpoint and entered a safe zone to decompress and collect yourself. And what's probably my favorite part of this game is that that you rarely have to recover from the scare factor, because the developers did an incredible job of giving you a feeling of total control, even in the most chaotic scenarios. No matter what situation you face, there's always a solution that turns an intimidating threat from horror into a manageable obstacle, and I love that. Don't get me wrong, I love a good scare, and I love a solid horror game. Rest in peace to this beauty. But it's hard for me to discuss, let alone recommend games like The Evil Within or even Dead Space to friends or family who aren't already fans of the genre. Admittedly, they're intimidating at first glance, and that's a shame because horror games are incredibly fun to play. The sense of accomplishment in overcoming fear and finding solutions when the stakes are high, I feel is unmatched across the gaming landscape. And Resident Evil 4 strikes that balance so perfectly that I feel gives it a unique level of approachability. It's a game that gives non-horror fans the ability to see what an experience on the scarier side can look like without the feeling of becoming completely overwhelmed. Just get past this, then you're good. I swear. I pinky swear. Okay, just get past this, and then you're okay. I swear. After this, it's a breeze. After this, it's smooth sailing. Never mind this. What's more is that I got to play the game without ever having played it before. It's not for my lack of trying, mind you. I did play Resident Evil 1 and 2 before, and of course, eventually I'd go on to play Dead Space multiple times, so I clearly enjoyed horror games. The problem was me. I was absolutely fucking dumb. Despite the back of the case literally telling you that this is a new take on Resident Evil, my dumb still tried to play the game like it was RE2. I remember getting up to the point the villagers attack you as you arrive to witness their bonfire? In failing to ever discover that what you needed to do to progress to the next section was just unload for a couple minutes. I would always manage to grab a shotgun in the house nearby that the game tries to force you to go into, take out a few enemies, but then would always die, either to the expenditure of all my ammunition or that hat with the chainsaw. For the longest time, I was trapped in this endless cycle of picking up the game for an hour, failing to figure out what I was supposed to do, dying a few times of course, and then walking away frustrated, only to try the same thing months later to get the exact same result. And for some reason, I never thought to look it up. Honestly, it was this video that pushed me to give the game that one last hurrah, where I would force myself to not put it down until I had played enough to actually experience what the developers intended. And now, I can't believe I ever made excuses to not play or make a video on this game. The story takes place 6 years after the catastrophe of Raccoon City. Leon, former police officer turned government agent, is tasked with a mission to rescue the US president's kidnapped daughter, Ashley Graham. His journey leads him deep into the remote countryside of Spain, to a village that isn't on any map and whose inhabitants are less welcoming than you probably hoped they would be. As Leon fights his way through the village, it quickly becomes clear that this isn't just a simple case of locals protecting their keep. Something far more sinister is clearly at work, and from everything that you can tell, these villagers are somehow tied to Ashley's abduction. At first, the plot might seem unremarkable, but I have to admit it quickly gains momentum, and by the end of your first hour-ish of gameplay, it's firing on all cylinders. Without giving too much away, the story centers on a mysterious cult, and maybe it's my religious upbringing or just the unsettling reality of cult-like behavior in the real world, but the focus on something so plausibly human feels far more compelling than the series' usual emphasis on the fantastical. I feel it grounded the horror, making it feel much more immediate and all the more terrifying. Even in this wake, you never never really feel like you're left without option or stuck in a corner because you're scared shitless. And that's largely in thanks to that focus on action Mikami fought so hard to have. It's something that doesn't sound like it should work on paper, but in practice, it actually works flawlessly. Outside of some of the game's bosses, there isn't an enemy in the game that you can't kick, pummel, or otherwise suplex into oblivion with a well-aimed shot and a press of the action button. And the ability to enact all these actions on a simple villager, as much as I can on the Chainsaw Man and even some bosses, it gives you a level of confidence and heroism that really isn't common in horror games. And because of this, I often found myself playing the game as if it was just a horror movie that had already played itself out, and the actions I was choosing to make were things that Leon already did. I just had to reenact them, and honestly, it made the game insanely fun to play. But at the same time, I'd have to be realistic. Not everyone is going to enjoy it. It is an insanely good game. There are still people who are skeptical about the horror genre, and the controls, while definitely a step up, are still tank by design, which isn't to everybody's liking. If you're watching this video, there is a good chance that you've played through the game already, but if you haven't, especially the original experience, no matter how you feel or the worries you have with this game, I would strongly encourage you to give it a shot, because speaking as somebody who put off playing the game for well over a decade, it is without a doubt one of the best games you will ever play. Even with the release of a remake, a game that's so good I feel deserves its own video, I still think that the original experience offers something you truly won't find anywhere else but within the walls of the original experience. Granted, it does have that 2005 game development charm, if you know what I mean. It never borders on being so heavily dated that you can't enjoy it from start to finish. Despite a few annoyances and some truly cringe-worthy dialogue, the original Resident Evil 4 is an experience I wholeheartedly recommend. At $45 for the GameCube version, $21 for the PlayStation 2 version, or even $50 for the Switch edition, or even the remake on Steam, Resident Evil 4 is absolutely worth the cost just to have the chance to experience the game. And considering the impact it had on the industry and its lasting influence on gaming as a whole, that legacy alone, I think, makes it a title well worth remembering, revisiting, and collecting.